Welcome to this Flame Guitars video, and you join me once again in my South London workshop. There's barely a day goes by when I'm not doing some sort of fretwork, whether that be leveling, recrowning, polishing frets, installing frets the first time in the guitars that I make. This guitar behind my shoulder here has come into the back end of its build. That's got stainless steel frets, or doing a refret. And over the years I must have done now hundreds of refrets. But I still find that refretting a Fender with a lacquered maple fretboard is the most challenging type of refret work to do. Why? Well, I thought I'd illustrate that with this 70's Strat that has come in for a refret and explain some of the challenges behind and associated with doing a refret on this type of neck. So let's have a look at this guitar in a bit more detail. So looking at this fretboard, the first thing I notice is how low these frets are. These are very sort of typical of the age, 2 millimeters wide, probably about 1 millimeter tall when new. But if I was to put a straight edge on, a feeler gauge underneath, I can just about get a 0.4 of a millimeter feeler gauge under there, possibly 0.5 in other places. Yeah, that definitely 0.4. And then if we look at the B string, G string, we can see some fairly deep depressions in these areas here of the fret. So here it's probably, the strings are actually probably sitting 0.3 of a millimeter above the fretboard. So, you know, all that makes for quite difficult playing. String bending is really quite challenging when the frets are as low as this. So definitely time for a refret to make this guitar more playable. Let's talk about the thickness of the finish and the fretboard on Fender guitars. So this is a 70's Strat, and they're sort of quite well known for having quite a thickness of finish, which this has. It's not excessive, and I've certainly seen some made in Mexico Fenders that probably have a thicker finish than this. More recent Fenders I've seen have got a fairly thin finish, which means that if you're trying to extract the frets, getting underneath the fret wire with pincers is reasonably straightforward. 90's Fenders have real problems with the finish adhering to the maple surface below, and you see quite a lot of lifting of the finish along this sort of playing surface, and you see these sort of score marks between the fret wire, indication the finish is not adhering well to the surface. In extreme cases, you can just get your fingernail underneath and flick off the finish. You know, I've had cases where I've been working on a fretboard, and just like a whole section of the finish has just sort of flaked off under my hand. Now, Fender install their frets and then spray over the top of the frets. And this has an implication for when you come to take the frets out. So if we look at this drawing here. Okay, so bear with my artwork here. So frets are in, and then Fender spray over the top of the frets. And what you get to a varying degree, and I'm sort of drawing this in exaggeration here, is a roll up of the finish over the side of the fret wire. So what that means is when you then come to extract the fret wire and try and get your pincers underneath the fret wire to lift it, the finish interferes with that, and that's the lower the fret wire in the first place, or because the frets have sort of been heavily leveled, the more challenging it is to lift the fret wire that way. Sometimes it's just impossible to do it. And even if you're successful in getting the fret wire out, when you then come to put the new fret wire in, it has a tendency just to sit on these raised parts of the finish and not seat properly on the fretboard, which is a really essential part of getting a really good refret job, is the frets all seat as well as can be achieved. On a rosewood, ebony fretboard, you can prep the surface properly before the frets are in. Much more challenging on a lacquered fretboard. And so sometimes you just have to rely a bit more on fret leveling to get a good job, which is not ideal, but it's just a compromise that has to be made if you're trying to sort of keep the original finish. Now let's talk about fret ends. Once the new frets are in, the fret ends have to be dressed. The last thing you want is to be playing with sharp fret ends. On a rosewood Fender fretboard, that's a relatively straightforward process, getting that right. But how do you do that on a maple board with the tools you're using, the technique you're using, that doesn't mean that you damage the finish on the edge of the fretboard? And over the years I've tried sort of a number of different techniques and ways of doing this. I'm now happy with how I'm doing it, but it's taken, I think, quite a few refret jobs on maple boards to get that right. And as I'm mostly now using stainless steel rather than nickel, stainless steel being so much harder, getting this bit right is even more challenging. It certainly takes a lot longer to do this, to properly dress the fret ends on a maple board than it does on a rosewood board. I've talked about using this tool to get under the fret wire and lift out the fret wire from its slot. Now those of you who know your Fender history will maybe be thinking, yeah, but you can't do that on this fretboard. And the reason for that is that up until the early 80s, Fender had this, I think, unique process, I don't think any other manufacturers were doing this, of installing their fret wire sideways. So all other manufacturers would install the frets from the top and push them in. Fender fret wire was pushed in from, or pulled in from the side. My understanding is from the bass side to the treble. So that if you try and extract the fret upwards, the barb attached to the fret wire, and I'll just sort of show you this, which maybe help to understand this. So fret wire in profile, this is the tang that sits in the fret slot, and attached to the tang is these barbs, which bite into the surface when the fret wire is pushed in and hold the fret wire in place. So on a Fender of this era, if you try and extract the fret that way, these barbs are breaking through the surface for the first time, and they will take out chunks of the maple as the fret wire is extracted. So on this guitar, what I need to do is drive the frets out sideways, the way they came in. The challenge for me here is this fret wire is so low that the technique and the tool I use to push out the fret wire, I've got very little height to work with to get some purchase to push out the fret wire sideways. But let's see how we get on. I've just taken out a few frets just to see how this process is going. It's going slowly. So what I need to do is create a ledge on the end of the fret wire, just so that this tool has got something to bite on, to purchase on, as I begin to tap and drive out the fret wire. And to create that ledge, I'm using a Dremel tool. I would normally use a fret guard just to protect the either side of the fret wire, the finish on either side of the fret wire, but the frets are so low, that's not going to work. So let's see how we get on. Okay, it's just starting to move. The angle in which I tap is important. If it's too high an angle, then I'm just sort of driving the fret wire down into the fret slot. Too shallow an angle and the tool just slips off. Okay. These first 5 frets have taken longer to get out than if I was doing removing the frets from the whole of the fretboard. But that's what we're working with. So let's move on to the next fret. So as you can see, all the frets are now out. If this was a rosewood fretboard, removing the frets would have taken me 5 minutes, 10 minutes max. This has taken an hour and a half, possibly more, to actually get all these frets out. As I go up the fretboard, I find, and I don't understand why this is the case, it becomes harder and harder to tap out the frets sideways. And these last 2 frets did not want to tap out at all, trying from the treble side and the bass side. So they had to come out through the top of the fretboard. And you can see nice clean slot there and the sort of jagged edge of the fret slot here. But that's the only way they were going to come out. I have agreed with the owner of this guitar that the finish on the fretboard will be removed. It's a judgment on a guitar of this age as to whether to do that. But as I said earlier, proper preparation of the fretboard is a really essential part of a good refret job, and I think this guitar will benefit from having this finish taken off and the surface prepared and then the new frets installed. I'm also going to replace the nut. That's a pretty ugly looking nut with really deep string slots, so that's going to come out and a nice new bone nut is going to be installed. The finish on the fretboard has been sanded off, and I've done that using a mixture of my Mirka power sander and then refining the surface with a radius block, 7¼ inch radius in this case. There was some inconsistency up and down the fretboard, so it was good to get that consistently 7¼ before the new frets go in, although on this end of the fretboard I have just flattened it very, very slightly from 7¼ to maybe 8-inch radius, which just helps when string bending, it's sort of helping with the choking out that occurs when string bending in this area. But there is one aspect of the shape of the fretboard edge, the rounding over on the fretboard edge, which I just want to look at and discuss before the frets go in, because that does have an implication on how the frets are installed, the fret end angle is achieved, and also on the choice of fret wire that you put in a guitar like this. It's probably quite hard to pick up on camera, but this neck has quite a significant rounding over on the edge of the fretboard, much more so than I would see on a typical Fender neck. So here's a couple of necks in profile. This one here reflects what you might typically see on manufacturers such as Ibanez, which have a pretty sharp angle at the end of the fretboard, which works well with the tall frets they have, and you often see quite a steep angle on the end of the fret wire on guitars such as Ibanez. This guitar that I'm working with now has this very pronounced rounding over on the edge of the fretboard. So what I have to do is work with that angle there that I've got. So that angle there, roughly, is going to dictate to me the shape of the end of the fret wire when I come to profile the ends of the fret wire. If I try and create quite a steep angle like that, which I sort of more typically see on an Ibanez, it's just not going to work. So therefore, this angle here is also narrowing the potential playing width of the top of the fret wire. So if I put on tall frets, this angle is going to come in slightly more and again reduce the width of the playing surface. So on a neck like this, with this rounded over profile, it's better to go for sort of fairly low fret wire height, 1mm, 1.2 at the very, very max. So now it's time to move on and install these frets. What's going in is stainless steel frets, 2mm wide, 1mm tall. I'm not going to show all the aspects of installing fret wire in this guitar. I've got a couple of videos that show in greater detail the installation of stainless steel fret wire in guitars. So if you want to know more about that, then have a look at those videos. The frets are in and they've been leveled, recrowned and polished. So I'm now ready to respray the fretboard. The fretboard has been refinished, and for that I used a water-based poly top coat. And I'm happy with how that's gone. There's almost no rolling up of the finish on the sides of the fret wire, so I haven't got a really thick finish, but sufficient finish here to protect the fretboard and have a nice sort of playing surface. The transition between the new and the existing finish, that looks seamless to me, so very happy with that. So this neck has a clear finish, but you can see in the neck pocket that's the original colour, but over the years the rest of the finish has taken on a slightly more honey colour. Quite a sort of difference in tone between those two areas, and you can see the same here under the tuners, slightly different colour under the tuners compared with the rest of the headstock. So when I came to refinish the fretboard, I was trying to match this colour. So I tinted the finish that I was applying. It's a little bit lighter. It's not a perfect match between the fretboard and the rest of the neck, but it's not too bad. So looking back over this job, is there anything I would do differently? Well, getting out the original frets was quite a challenge. Some of the frets, particularly up this end of the fretboard, were really quite difficult to get out. And someone asked me a few days ago on one of my YouTube videos about whether I heat frets when taking them out from a finished maple fretboard. Generally I don't, because I'm concerned about the heat transferring from the fret wire onto the adjacent finishing and damaging the finish, scorching the finish. And I have seen that on guitars where they've been refretted. Someone has just overheated the fret wire and you can see the surrounding finish is scorched. So I don't do that, but I think reflecting back on this job, maybe what I should have done was make a decision early on whether I'm going to refinish the fretboard or not. And if I'm going to refinish it, then it allows me just to heat the fret wire, which may have made that sort of tapping out process just a little bit easier. So now it's time to fix this neck back onto body, finish off making a new bone nut, put some strings on and do the setup.